They mocked him behind his back and whispered that he should have retired years ago, but the man they dismissed as just the old janitor had once commanded missions that shaped nations. And when a four-star general walked through the school board doors demanding answers, everything changed. What began as a quiet dismissal turned into a national lesson about respect, service, and the silent strength of those we overlook. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harland Boyd had been sweeping the halls of Fairview High for nearly 17 years, longer than many of the teachers had been employed, and longer than most of the students had even been alive. Each morning he arrived before dawn, coffee in hand, keys jangling at his hip, long before the first classroom lights flickered on. With his slow, measured gait and stooped shoulders, Harland looked every bit the aging man the school board quietly labeled as past his prime. But the floors gleamed under his watch, the boiler room ran like a tuned engine, and every student who ever found themselves stranded outside a locked gym or caught in the rain without an umbrella could count on Mr. Boyd appearing at just the right moment, usually before they even realized they needed help. To most, he was just the janitor. To a few, he was a dependable fixture, like the old oak tree out by the football field. And like that tree, they assumed he'd always be there, until one day, without much noise, the board decided it was time to uproot him. The letter came in a manila envelope, thin and formal, folded with the coldness of bureaucracy. They cited budget concerns, then slipped in a note about his age, about efficiency, and the need to modernize operations. There was no farewell assembly, no thanks, no gold watch. Just an HR form and a suggestion to apply for early retirement benefits. The custodian, who had quietly rebuilt half the school's infrastructure with his own hands, was being replaced by a private company whose workers had no names, no ties to the town, and no care for the halls they walked through. The news trickled down fast. By lunch, students whispered rumors that Mr. Boyd had been fired. Some thought he'd finally retired. Others figured he'd gotten sick. A few teachers raised mild concerns, but with budget season approaching and pink slips floating through other departments too, no one wanted to speak too loudly. It wasn't personal. At least that's what they told themselves. But for the students, particularly the ones who didn't fit neatly into student council photos or varsity team rosters, Harland Boyd's disappearance was like ripping out a foundation stone. Over the years, he'd become an unofficial counselor, handyman, and silent watcher of the invisible kids. The boy who didn't speak much in class but always helped reset the cafeteria chairs. The girl who wore hand-me-down shoes and once found a warm coat in her locker after Mr. Boyd noticed her shivering. The twins who lost their father in Afghanistan and were always met with a knowing nod from the janitor on Veterans Day. He never pried, never asked questions, but his presence was a comfort, a constant, a quiet kind of strength the school never realized it depended on until it was gone. In the days after his departure, things began to break, literally and figuratively. The new custodial team was efficient but indifferent. They mopped around students instead of waiting for them to pass. They ignored the clogged sinks that Harland used to fix on his lunch break. The boiler went down twice in 1 week. Lockers stuck, light bulbs flickered, trash cans overflowed. But more than that, the soul of the place felt off. Teachers grumbled about the smell in the stairwells. Students walked around wrappers and messes. There was graffiti in the second-floor bathroom for the first time in years. Then came the Monday morning board meeting, held in the sleek new auditorium the district had spent nearly $2 million upgrading last spring, the same space where his name was never mentioned in the project credits. It was supposed to be a routine meeting, budget forecasts, a discussion about replacing outdated textbooks, a slideshow on digital modernization. The room was filled with polite indifference and administrative jargon. Until the back doors opened. He walked in wearing a deep green service uniform, adorned with ribbons and medals that most in the room didn't recognize but instinctively respected. His presence changed the air. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, phones were lowered, even the superintendent shifted in his seat. 4 stars shone on his shoulders. General Marcus Thorne. He wasn't on the agenda, no one had invited him, and yet the moment he entered, it was clear that he belonged, or more accurately, that his authority didn't require permission. No one connected him to Harland Boyd yet, not as the general took his seat quietly in the back row, crossed his legs, and waited for public comments to begin. But that was about to change, and so began the unraveling of assumptions, the dismantling of quiet disrespect, and the revelation of a truth so profound that it would ripple through the town for years to come. Harland Boyd had not always been a janitor, and Fairview was about to learn exactly who they let go. The pattern had been forming for years, though Harland Boyd had never spoken word about it. First came the subtle hints, the way the younger staff would talk over him in meetings when he offered mechanical advice, as if a janitor couldn't possibly understand circuitry or water pressure systems. Then came the changed tone from the newer vice principal, Mrs. Kearns, who began referring to him as Old Man Boyd in private emails, later leaked during a disciplinary review. They called it humor, office banter, nothing serious. But Harland noticed how those laughs got louder when he entered a room and quieter when he left, how they ignored his reports on faulty fire alarms or aging wiring until they failed spectacularly, and then acted surprised. He began to understand that no matter how carefully he documented things, no matter how quickly he fixed them, he was being slowly erased. A few years prior, Harland had saved the school thousands by reworking the heating system during winter break. The original estimate had come in just under $30,000. Harland did it for the cost of a few copper fittings and some solder. When asked how he knew how to manage such a complex system, he'd simply shrugged and said, "Used to fix bigger things than schools." No one had bothered to ask what that meant. They were content to file the savings report under operational luck and move on. The real shift began when a new superintendent, Dr. Alyssa Hartley, took over the district. Young, ambitious, and with a resume polished for political optics, she had grand plans for streamlining operations. Outsourcing was her mantra. She spoke of efficiency like it was scripture. During one of her early staff briefings, she singled out janitorial services as an area of outdated redundancy and floated the idea of replacing long-term employees with a third-party contractor. Harland was sitting in the back of the room when she said it, sipping coffee from the same dented thermos he'd used for over a decade. His name was never mentioned, but he felt the target painted on his back. Afterward, Dr. Hartley walked past him without a nod. To her, he was furniture. Over time, the dismissals became more deliberate. Harland's hours were cut, then restored only after students complained that no one had opened the gym on time. Supplies started disappearing from the maintenance closet. The new crew members under his supervision began ignoring his instructions, citing a different protocol suggested by central office. It wasn't just disrespect, it was strategic. A slow chipping away at relevance, a quiet erosion of standing. When the final evaluation came in, the one that sealed his termination, it listed declining physical stamina and resistance to technological adaptation as key concerns. Harland had laughed softly at the mention of technology. The same week the report was filed, he'd restored the computer network in the AV room after the IT specialist failed to respond to 3 urgent tickets. But no one had asked how he did it. They just assumed it had fixed itself. They didn't know that Harland once taught soldiers how to set up satellite uplinks in desert outposts, or how to wire communication arrays under enemy fire. He didn't speak of those things, not because he was hiding them, but because no one ever thought to ask. His departure was coldly efficient, a 20-minute meeting with an HR representative who barely made eye contact, a pre-written statement read aloud with all the emotion of a parking ticket. Your service has been appreciated. However, due to evolving operational demands and shifting institutional priorities, your position is being retired. Retired, as if his entire identity could be folded neatly into a euphemism and filed away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Students found out the following day when his name was removed from the staff board. Some teachers sent polite emails asking where he'd gone. The administration responded with a vague line about transitions and modern strategies.
Those who asked too many questions were told to focus on their curriculum. But some students noticed more than others. Jamie Crenshaw, the junior who spent her lunches sketching blueprints in the back of the library, recalled how Mr. Boyd had taught her how to calibrate a laser cutter last semester after the shop teacher gave up on the broken one. Malik Henderson, a sophomore, constantly at odds with authority, remembered the day Harlan quietly sat beside him after he'd been benched from the basketball team and simply said, "Don't let one mistake define the rest of your season. No lectures, no judgment, just presence." Then there was Evan Rizzo, a senior whose father had died in service 6 years ago. Evan had never spoken to anyone about it, but he always nodded at Mr. Boyd during the flag ceremonies and noticed that the janitor always stood a little straighter, hand on his chest, eyes forward. One day, Evan had asked what branch he served in. Harlan had simply smiled and said, "A long time ago, in a few places." That was all. Nothing more. These moments stayed with them even as the school moved on, even as the floors lost their shine, as the new janitors walked past messes they didn't feel paid enough to clean, as the walls felt colder and the staff more indifferent. Harlan's absence wasn't loud, but it was felt, deeply. And then came the flyer, a district-wide notice about the upcoming budget hearing. A small note at the bottom mentioned that the public could attend. Few people ever did. Board meetings were dry affairs, full of charts and acronyms and rubber-stamped decisions. But this one would be different, because while Harland Boyd may have left the building without protest, there were others who hadn't forgotten him, and one of them wore 4 stars on his shoulder. It had always been the small things with Harland Boyd, the things most people missed or never thought to notice.
He never spoke much, but he always listened, always observed. When a water fountain sprayed unevenly, it wasn't just a maintenance report he filed. He'd often have it fixed before anyone even mentioned it. When the auditorium lights flickered during a rehearsal, it was Mr. Boyd who climbed the rickety scaffold after hours, replaced the ballast, and tightened the loose housing that would have eventually caused a fire. He never logged it. He didn't ask for recognition. He just did what needed to be done, quietly, thoroughly, and without complaint. His movements were deliberate, not slow. To the untrained eye, it looked like age, but to anyone who truly watched, there was precision in everything he did. When he rolled up electrical cords, they were coiled perfectly, military style. When he carried heavy equipment, he shifted his stance in a way that protected his lower back, knees bent slightly, weight distributed evenly, the movements of someone who had learned discipline long before he ever held a mop. Some of the older veterans on the faculty noticed it, but they kept their nods private. It wasn't their story to tell. A few students, however, had picked up on his quiet mastery. Backstage during school plays, the tech crew had started calling him the Wizard because anytime something broke, a fuse, a mic cable, a jammed curtain, Mr. Boyd could fix it in seconds. He taught them to tie proper knots, to color-code wires, and to always carry spare fuses, even when they thought they wouldn't need them. He never raised his voice, but when he gave advice, everyone listened. He had that kind of authority, the kind that didn't shout, but somehow commanded attention. In the chemistry lab, Mrs. Levington once mentioned in passing how the gas lines under the sinks had been leaking for years, and no one could figure out how to reroute them. A week later, the gas smell was gone, the new lines were labeled, and a handwritten diagram was taped inside the cabinet. No one saw him do it, but everyone knew who had. Still, no one wrote a thank you note. No one asked how he knew how to handle gas pressure systems without a manual. When the school's surveillance system went down during a series of break-ins, the district IT team spent 2 weeks blaming wiring and software conflicts. Harlan quietly traced the fault to a damaged relay in the breaker box that had shorted during a lightning storm. He replaced it, rebooted the system, and the cameras were live again within an hour. The security officer offered him a handshake, but the administration never heard about it. Or maybe they had and just didn't want to give credit where it was due. Even the new custodial staff brought in to replace him had unknowingly leaned on his old work. His labeling system on pipes and wires, the tool closet organized by color-coded pegs, the handwritten logbook under the boiler cannel, all relics of his meticulous methods. The new crew used his systems but never gave them a second thought.
When they failed to understand how to reset the heating system after a power surge, they called in an outside contractor for $1,200. The contractor discovered a simple circuit trip, one that Harland could have fixed in less than 10 minutes with a flathead screwdriver and some electrician's tape. Students had also started to piece together fragments of his past. Harland never wore anything flashy, but a few observant kids noticed the scar along his left wrist, the kind you don't get from janitorial work. Others noticed the precise way he folded and unfolded his jacket, or how he always stood when the national anthem played. Hand over heart, feet shoulder-width apart, back straight. Once, during a loud fire drill that sent several students into a panic, Harland had calmly walked through the smoke-filled corridors, checking doors and gently guiding students outside. His presence had a grounding effect, not just calm, but practiced. One student remarked afterward that he moved like a firefighter, but another, whose older brother served in the Marines, said no, he moved like a soldier trained in extraction. No one ever asked him about it directly, not because they weren't curious, but because there was something about the way he carried himself that made you think twice about prying. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't offering. The story was there, written in his eyes, in the way he seemed to already know what needed to be done before anyone else even recognized a problem. But it wasn't just his technical competence that stood out. It was the way he treated people, especially those who had little power. He noticed the freshmen who wore the same shoes all year and left new sneakers in his locker over winter break. He helped the cafeteria staff haul food deliveries up the icy loading ramp without ever being asked. When the ESL teacher lost her father and took time off, Harland watered the plants in her classroom every morning and turned the blinds so the sun wouldn't damage the leaves. No one asked him to. He just paid attention. The deeper truth was this. Harland Boyd wasn't just competent, he was exceptional. And the world around him had become so accustomed to surface-level performance, so obsessed with degrees, titles, and youth, that they no longer recognized mastery when it didn't come wrapped in prestige. He had been underestimated, not because he lacked value, but because his value didn't announce itself with credentials or bravado. It revealed itself in function, in what got done when no one else could do it. And now that he was gone, the absence was starting to speak louder than he ever had. But soon, that quiet competence would be impossible to ignore. Because the man who once trusted Harland Boyd with lives, not just buildings, was on his way to make sure the board understood exactly who they had fired.
Fairview High had always operated on a precarious rhythm, one tuned not to excellence, but to just enough. Just enough funding to keep the lights on, just enough support to avoid headlines, just enough oversight to pretend everything was functioning. But the truth was, that rhythm had only worked because Harland Boyd had kept the machinery humming beneath the surface. He had been the invisible metronome that steadied the entire operation. Without him, the cracks widened. At first, it was a series of minor inconveniences. Lights left on overnight, supply closets locked when they were supposed to be open, bathroom stalls with missing locks. The new custodial team, hired through a third-party contractor, cycled employees in and out every few weeks. None of them stayed long enough to learn the layout of the building, let alone care about its nuances. They cleaned only what was listed in their contract, and when something broke, they logged it and waited. There was no improvisation, no initiative, no quiet interventions in the middle of the night. Where Harland once kept the building not only functional, but whole, the replacements merely kept it from falling apart entirely, and even that, barely. Then winter came. The first snowstorm of the season rolled in fast, shutting down several schools across the district. Fairview remained open, but barely. The heat in the West Wing, where most of the science and math classrooms were, had begun to fail, a slow decline that no one caught until the radiators went cold and the classrooms dipped into the low 50s. Teachers bundled up in coats, students clutched thermoses of lukewarm cocoa, and fingers stiffened over test papers. The temporary solution was to shift those classes into the gym, but the gym's sound system had been glitching for weeks, and the chairs scraped against the floor with an ear-piercing grind that made concentration impossible.
The disruption cost the school a week of instruction right before state assessments. Parents began to notice. Complaints flooded the administration office, but the responses were tepid and vague. "We're working with contractors to address the issue. The heating system is under evaluation. We appreciate your patience during this transitional period." But there were no solutions, just delays. Then came the sprinkler incident. A faulty sensor in the main corridor activated the emergency system during second period on a Thursday morning. Water gushed from the ceiling like a broken dam, soaking textbooks, backpacks, and a dozen student-made posters lining the walls. The fire alarm blared, students were evacuated into the snow, and by the time the district response team arrived, damage had already been done. One classroom's computers were fried. The library lost hundreds of dollars in donated books. But worst of all, the ceiling tiles, soaked through and sagging, collapsed in chunks onto the hallway floor. Photos circulated online within hours. Fairview's hallway looked like a war zone. The district tried to contain the fallout. They blamed an unfortunate equipment failure exacerbated by recent weather events. But teachers knew better. Harland had warned them about that very sprinkler line 2 years ago, having spotted condensation forming near the junction valve. He'd submitted a work order, even rechecked it himself after hours, but the administration had filed it away and forgot. That line had been a ticking bomb, and now it had exploded, soaking not just the building, but the school's already shaky reputation. But perhaps the most significant crisis came not in a gush of water or a gust of cold, but in the quiet failure of trust. Students, once comfortable confiding in Harland in moments of anxiety or trouble, found no one to fill the void. There was no longer anyone roaming the halls who knew when a kid was about to break before a teacher even noticed. One student, Kevin Montrose, a senior struggling silently with the weight of being the only breadwinner at home after his father's injury, had often eaten lunch in the boiler room with Harland. The janitor never pried. He just shared half a sandwich and let the silence do the talking. After Harland's departure, Kevin began skipping school. Then he vanished entirely. The guidance office sent automated emails. No one followed up. Not until it was too late. By February, the school board's scheduled meeting had shifted from routine to urgent. Parent groups demanded answers. Faculty meetings devolved into venting sessions. Local news outlets began poking around, and looming quietly in the background was General Marcus Thorne, a name unfamiliar to most in the district, but not to those who had worn the uniform. He had first learned of Harland's dismissal through a forwarded email from a former colleague who now worked for a veterans outreach program. The message was simple. "Did you know Harland Boyd got canned by a school board? Thought you'd want to know. Doesn't seem right." Marcus Thorne had once commanded entire operations across foreign soil, advised presidents, and overseen missions that would never be named in public record. But few things ignited his fury like watching the quiet warriors of the world, the ones who served without glory, be discarded by institutions too blind to recognize them. He made a few calls, discreet ones, confirmed details, asked for a copy of the school's public board meeting schedule. Then, without press, without ceremony, he boarded a flight and arrived in Fairview 2 days before the meeting. He didn't notify the media. He didn't announce his presence. He checked into a small hotel under a civilian alias and requested a visitor badge at the district building using his actual name, though no one seemed to realize who he was.
But his timing was not coincidental. He knew Fairview was on the verge of collapse, not just structurally, but morally. And he knew that what came next wouldn't be a confrontation. It would be a reckoning. The quiet dignity that Harland Boyd had carried through the halls of that school would finally speak, if not through his own voice, then through someone whose words no one could ignore. The building might have forgotten Harland Boyd, but the people he served alongside hadn't. And the 4 stars approaching the board meeting were about to remind Fairview what true service looks like. It was still dark outside when Harland Boyd stepped off the city bus and made his way down Ashwood Avenue, the morning chill biting into his coat.
The school he had once maintained, like his own home, stood silhouetted against the blue-gray sky, lights already glowing behind frosted windows. He paused across the street and stared at it for a moment, hands deep in his pockets. This had been his world for almost 2 decades. Not a job, a post. A post he had guarded quietly, honorably, and without expectation. They had taken it from him without hesitation. And yet, as he looked across the quiet morning stillness, he felt no anger. What he felt was distance, as if the building itself had become unfamiliar, like a place he had only dreamed about once. Harland knew the board meeting was happening tonight. He'd seen the flyer, the carefully worded announcements. He hadn't planned to go. He didn't believe in fighting for a place that had decided it no longer valued him. But something inside him had shifted when he received the call from an old voice he hadn't heard in nearly 15 years. Marcus Thorne didn't call unless it mattered. And if Marcus was coming, something significant was about to unfold. The voice on the other end of the line had been unmistakable, measured, direct, but warmer than Harland remembered. The general had asked only one question: "You gonna be there?" And Harland, after a long silence, said, "Yes." He hadn't realized what that yes meant until now. It meant he would have to stand in front of the very people who had discarded him, not as a janitor, but as something far more complicated. Harland turned and began walking toward the community center. He wasn't dressed in his usual coveralls. Today, he wore a simple dark coat, black boots polished to a shine, and under the layers, the creased uniform he had kept sealed in a garment bag at the back of his closet for more than a decade. It no longer fit as snugly as it once had, but it still carried the weight of 1,000 memories. Memories he had never shared with anyone at Fairview High. When the school board fired him, they hadn't just cut loose a janitor. They had released a man who had served in 2 wars, a master sergeant who had led troops through hellish terrain and brought nearly all of them back. He had defused bombs with shaking fingers in deserts where the sun burned the metal too hot to touch. He had patched wounded comrades with whatever supplies he could find, sometimes using only pressure and prayer. And when the dust settled, when the planes brought them home, Harland had chosen quiet over glory. He'd traded medals for mop buckets, camouflage for canvas gloves. He'd buried that chapter, not out of shame, but because he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had chosen a life of simplicity, of routine. And for 17 years, he kept the halls of Fairview safe and functioning, not because it was his job, but because that school had become his new post. No one asked where he came from. No one cared. They just assumed he was an old man who had missed his chance at something better. But today, for the first time in years, he allowed that version of himself to awaken. It wasn't a full transformation, not yet. But as he walked through the city toward the auditorium where the board meeting would take place, something changed in his posture. The slight stoop in his shoulders straightened. His steps became more purposeful. The weight of his years, once disguised as weariness, shifted into presence. Not authority in the loud chest-beating sense. It was quieter than that. Deeper, like the air before a thunderstorm. The town hadn't seen Harland Boyd in uniform for decades. And even now, beneath his coat, no one could see it yet, but something in his eyes had returned. The edge, the clarity, the sense of quiet command. When he stopped at the crosswalk and a group of students rushed past him laughing, one of them slowed, nodded at him respectfully without knowing why, and then hurried to catch up with his friends. That, too, was part of the shift. People sensed things, even when they couldn't articulate them. That evening, the school auditorium filled slowly. Parents filtered in wearing coats and tension. Teachers clutched notes. The board members took their places on the elevated platform, smiles tight, eyes scanning the room with cautious professionalism. Dr. Hartley, the superintendent, sat in the center, flanked by 2 district advisors. She wore a crisp gray blazer and a practiced expression of leadership. She had prepped her responses. She had no idea what was coming.
Harland arrived 5 minutes later. No one noticed at first. Just another man in a coat, walking slowly down the side aisle. But then he removed the coat. The olive drab uniform underneath was immaculate, On his chest, rows of service ribbons shimmered, campaign medals, commendations, distinctions that most civilians had never seen outside of documentaries. The patches on his shoulder marked him as a former combat medic. The subdued chevrons told a story of leadership forged in fire. And when he took his seat across from the general, their eyes met with the kind of respect that doesn't require words. The board still hadn't realized what was happening. Not yet. But the room had begun to shift, because Harland Boyd wasn't sitting in the back anymore. He wasn't hiding in plain sight. He was taking his position. And by the end of the night, the entire town would see him not as the old janitor they had fired, but as the man he had always been. The room fell into a hush as the school board meeting was officially called to order. Dr. Hartley leaned into her microphone, her voice smooth and practiced as she welcomed attendees, outlining the evening's agenda with all the polish of someone who had done this 100 times before. Charts flickered to life on the projector behind her, graphs showing budget allocations, efficiency ratings, cost-saving initiatives. She was in her element, comfortable in the sterile structure of policy and performance metrics. For the first 20 minutes, the meeting moved forward with predictable rhythm. Maintenance expenses, textbook shortages, after-school programming cuts. Words were exchanged, motions proposed, seconded, passed. Everything was ordinary until it wasn't. The room shifted when the floor was opened to public comment. Most meetings saw a few parents speak, one or two teachers, maybe a concerned citizen or two, and this one started no differently. A mother expressed concern over mold in the lower wing bathrooms. A teacher pleaded for updated lab equipment. A student representative asked about the possibility of restoring the after-school arts program. All valid concerns, all handled with bureaucratic nods and vague promises of further review. Then, as the moderator prepared to close the comments, a voice from the back interrupted. Calm, deep, clear. "I'd like to speak." Heads turned. The man was already standing. He didn't walk fast, didn't rush. He moved with the deliberate pace of someone who didn't need to prove anything. Harland Boyd walked to the front of the auditorium, past the rows of folding chairs, past stunned teachers and whispering students, past board members who blinked at him without recognition. Or if they did recognize him, it was only as the man they had let go, the man who used to mop floors. He stepped up to the microphone, adjusting it slightly. The lights above him revealed the details of his uniform now, the deep olive green fabric worn at the edges, the campaign ribbons lined with precise symmetry, the combat medic badge glinting faintly under the spotlight. The silence was total. "I'm Harland Boyd," he began, voice steady, hands at his sides. "Some of you knew me as the janitor here at Fairview High." There was a flicker of awkward recognition among the board members, a few uneasy glances. Dr. Hartley offered a tight-lipped nod, clearly expecting a complaint or an impassioned but ultimately inconsequential speech. "What most of you don't know," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "is that before I cleaned your hallways and fixed your boilers, I served 26 years in the United States Army. I was a master sergeant attached to a special operations unit for most of my career. I've spent nights in jungle heat and desert cold. I've carried wounded men through firefights. I've patched them up on the back of moving transports with nothing but gauze and instinct. I've seen what it means to lead, not from behind a desk, but in places where leadership means someone comes home alive." A collective breath left the room. Dr. Hartley leaned forward, as if trying to interrupt, but the moderator raised a hand. Harland had the floor. "I don't tell you this to brag. I never brought it up while I worked here, because my service wasn't supposed to define me. I came here to serve in a different way, quietly, reliably, in the background. I fixed what broke. I watched out for your kids. I gave them space when they needed it and structure when they couldn't find any. And for 17 years, I never missed a shift, not one." He paused then, letting the weight of the silence carry his words deeper. But when the budget got tight, when the spreadsheet started dictating who mattered and who didn't,
I was deemed expendable, too old, outdated, inefficient. Not a word about my service here, just a letter in an envelope. By now, the students in the audience were sitting upright, many of them stunned. Some looked ashamed. Teachers who had once waved politely at Harland in the hallways now found themselves unable to meet his gaze. One by one, the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the recognition dawning too late. I didn't come here tonight for revenge. I came because I believe in something bigger than personal pride. I came because this school is failing, not just in maintenance, but in values. You replaced commitment with convenience, loyalty with contracts, quiet competence with empty titles. Then he stepped back from the microphone, and that's when General Marcus Thorne rose from the back row. Unlike Harland, the general didn't need to introduce himself. His reputation had preceded him. The murmurs had already begun the moment he entered the room. But now, standing tall in his dark blue suit, the presence of his rank became undeniable. He walked to the front and turned to face the board. Not the audience, the board.
"I am General Marcus Thorne," he said, voice like polished steel. "I've commanded troops across 3 continents. I've advised defense strategy to leaders whose names are known across the world. But tonight, I am here on behalf of Master Sergeant Harland Boyd." He turned briefly to Harland, then back to the stunned board members. "I've never trusted a man more than I trusted this one," the general continued. "On more than one occasion, I've watched him hold together missions with grit, brilliance, and grace. Men lived because of his decisions. I wouldn't be standing here if not for him. And when he left the service, he chose to serve again, not with medals or headlines, but with a mop in one hand and integrity in the other. That you would dismiss someone of his caliber without so much as a handshake tells me everything I need to know about your leadership." There was no need to shout. The general's voice was calm, deliberate, and utterly damning. "I came here tonight to remind you that service is not always loud. It's not always wrapped in titles or budgets. Sometimes it's a man showing up every day for years, keeping your walls from crumbling while you're too busy looking the other way." Then he stepped back and sat down. The silence that followed was not one of awe, but of realization. The kind of heavy, stinging silence that settles only when the truth finally breaks through years of noise. In that moment, the board didn't see Harland Boyd as the janitor. They saw the man they had ignored, the quiet guardian they had discarded, not just of the building, but of their students, their community, and their own values. And nothing would ever be the same again. The silence after the general's words lingered in the air like fog, thick and unmoving, suffocating the room with a weight that not even the most seasoned bureaucrat could shrug off. The board members sat stiffly behind the polished oak table, staring at nothing, their expressions caught between embarrassment and disbelief. Dr. Hartley looked down at her tablet, but it was clear she wasn't reading anything. Her fingers hovered, twitching slightly, as if scrolling might offer an escape from the moment now bearing down on her. But there was no escape, not from this. Harland Boyd remained where he was, near the podium, no longer the man they had dismissed with paperwork and empty smiles. He had not raised his voice, he had not demanded compensation or retribution, and yet his presence stood taller than any accusation could have. The room had been forced to see what it had refused to acknowledge for nearly 2 decades, that greatness could wear dusty boots, that quiet dignity could sweep floors, and that sometimes the most essential people in a community are the ones no one bothers to look at twice. Then Harland stepped forward once more. He didn't speak from the microphone this time. He addressed the room without amplification, but still his voice carried. It wasn't the volume that drew attention, but the depth of what he was about to say. I spent most of my adult life in places where every decision could cost lives. When I left that world, I didn't want ceremony. I didn't want medals or headlines. I wanted peace. I wanted purpose. And I found it here, not in the job title, but in the work, in keeping the lights on so kids could study, in fixing broken lockers so a kid could feel like they mattered, in changing a light bulb before anyone even noticed it had gone out. That was enough for me. His gaze moved across the room, touching on the teachers, the students, the parents. No anger, only clarity. But I want you to understand something. It's not too late. Not for me. I'll be fine. I've stood in front of tougher crowds in more dangerous rooms than this. But for the kids who walk these halls every day, the lesson you're teaching them matters. When you make decisions based only on appearances, when you reward flash over function, and when you ignore the people doing the quiet, necessary work, that's a failure of leadership, and it's a failure of heart. The auditorium remained silent, not out of discomfort now, but out of reverence. Harland had become something larger than the man they thought they knew. In the span of a single meeting, he had transformed from a footnote in a budget report to a living embodiment of wisdom, the kind earned through blood, sweat, and quiet service. Then he turned toward the students. To those of you still growing, still learning, I need you to hear this. What you do matters more than what you're called. Titles fade, applause dies, but showing up, doing your job with integrity, treating people with dignity, that is what lasts. Don't ever think you're above any job, and don't ever believe someone else's worth can be measured by what they wear or how much they make. You look closer, you listen harder, because the people who seem invisible might be the ones holding your whole world together.
A murmur of agreement passed through the student section. Even some of the teachers nodded, not out of obligation, but from something deeper. Recognition, realization, maybe even guilt. And then, for the first time all night, Dr. Hartley finally spoke. Her voice was tight, brittle, carefully composed. She began to thank Harland for his years of service, using the kind of polished language that sounded borrowed from a script. But halfway through, her voice cracked. She paused, blanked, and tried again, only to stop short. What was there to say? What words could possibly match the moment? Harland didn't wait for her to finish. He offered her a small, respectful nod, not one of forgiveness or defiance, but of finality. He had said what he came to say. He had nothing more to prove. His truth had been laid bare, and it had spoken louder than any applause or protest. General Thorne stood once again, his gesture subtle. He didn't speak this time. He simply moved to Harland's side, extended a hand, and in front of everyone, the two men embraced. Not a staged hug, not a performative gesture, but the kind of clasp that only brothers in arms can share. The kind that honors time, pain, loyalty, and sacrifice. The kind that says, I see you. The audience rose, not all at once, but steadily, a standing ovation not born from expectation, but from transformation. Even the students who didn't fully grasp the military past or the administrative betrayal knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The applause grew, not wild, but solid, steady, like the man who had earned it. And as Harland turned to leave, stepping down the auditorium steps with the quiet dignity he had always carried, no one saw just an old janitor anymore. They saw a man who had lived 100 lives in silence. A man who taught them what respect truly means. A man who reminded an entire community that greatness often walks among us unseen, until we finally choose to look.
the echoes of applause faded into a quiet that felt altogether different from the silence that had filled the auditorium earlier that evening. This new quiet was reflective, almost sacred, a pause thick with thought. As Harland Boyd disappeared down the back aisle with General Marcus Thorne beside him, the board sat motionless, caught in the wreckage of their own assumptions. The air felt different now, not heavy with authority, but weighted with accountability. The carefully maintained order of their meeting had been shattered by the undeniable presence of truth, and now they were left to sit in it. The next morning, the halls of Fairview High felt changed. Students gathered in clusters, whispering about the night before. Some had been there. Some had only seen the video already spreading online, but all of them spoke of Harland Boyd like he had become something mythic overnight. There was footage, of course. Someone in the third row had filmed the entire speech on their phone and uploaded it before the meeting had even ended. By sunrise, the video had been shared thousands of times, captions ranging from "Our janitor was a war hero" to "The school board messed with the wrong man." But viral attention wasn't the true shift. The real change settled into the way students walked the halls, how teachers spoke in the break room, how staff greeted one another in the morning. There was a strange stillness that comes after an earthquake, when everyone realizes the world hasn't ended, but it's no longer the same. For the first time in years, people looked each other in the eyes. The cafeteria workers were greeted by name. The custodian who filled in after Harland's dismissal received morning nods and offers of help he'd never gotten before. People started noticing things, noticing each other. In the administration building, Dr. Hartley called an emergency staff meeting. It was rare for her to do so without weeks of preparation, but the events of the previous evening had shaken her more deeply than she was willing to admit aloud. She stood at the front of the conference room, her usually flawless composure dimmed. In place of the confident bureaucrat was someone forced to see herself from the outside, and she didn't like what she saw. She opened by acknowledging Harland's speech. She didn't try to spin it. She didn't pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, she paused, then simply said, "We failed him, and we failed ourselves." She explained that, effective immediately, the school would be reviewing all staff roles and employment decisions made under the recent budget cuts. There would be open dialogue with faculty and community members, and more importantly, those conversations would include the voices most often left out: the aides, the maintenance workers, the bus drivers, the cafeteria teams. No more quiet corners, no more invisible workers. But talk, as always, was only the beginning. Action would have to follow. Later that week, the student body held a ceremony of their own. It was supposed to be a small event, a tribute during morning assembly, nothing formal, but word spread quickly. What began as a handful of students in the gym turned into the entire school showing up. The band played a subdued version of the national anthem. Posters lined the walls with messages handwritten in bold Sharpie. "Thank you, Mr. Boy," and "Service isn't always loud." At the front of the gym stood an empty custodial cart, cleaned and polished until it shone. Draped across it was an American flag folded into the crisp triangle reserved for the highest of honors. In front of it, a plaque was revealed, in honor of Harland Boyd, soldier, servant, guardian. The room didn't cheer. They stood in silence, a collective heartbeat of respect.
Teachers who had barely known the man before now found themselves swallowing back emotion. Students who had once walked past him without a word now stood shoulder to shoulder, reverent. Something deeper than tribute was taking place. It wasn't just about Harland anymore. It was about everything he represented: humility, integrity, and the quiet power of doing the right thing without ever demanding recognition. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Hartley made a surprising move. She publicly offered Harland his position back, not as a formality, not for publicity, but in a letter handwritten in her own script, delivered in person. She waited outside the home where he now lived with his sister and her family, the envelope in hand. When Harland answered the door, she didn't speak immediately. She simply handed him the letter and waited.
eyes filled with the kind of honest remorse that no press statement could replicate. Harland opened the envelope and read it quietly on the porch. When he finished, he looked up at her, not with judgment, not with resentment, but with the calm eyes of a man who had already made peace with his past. "I appreciate it," he said, and his voice held no trace of bitterness. "But I think my time there is done." He didn't decline out of anger. He declined because he had already completed the mission he hadn't known he was on. His return would have been redundant. He had already changed the school far more by leaving than he ever could by staying. Still, he smiled and added, "If you ever need help fixing something that matters, you know where to find me." Back at the school, small changes began to take root. Teachers began holding open office hours where students could talk about anything, not just academics. Staff appreciation days were created, not the kind with shallow banners, but real efforts to connect with and learn about the people who kept the school running. A mentorship program was born, pairing students with support staff to learn life skills, respect, and the value of hard work. And every day, as students walked into the main hallway, they passed the framed tribute to Harland Boyd, not because it was required, not because someone made them stop, but because they wanted to remember, because they chose to look up. The relationships once defined by hierarchy and assumption were now being rewritten. Students had become protectors of respect. Teachers had become learners of humility, and administrators, once guarded behind walls of policy, had opened their doors to listen. And at the heart of this transformation, though no longer physically present, stood Harland Boyd, not with a mop, but with a legacy that could not be scrubbed away. A legacy earned not in noise, but in quiet. Not through speeches, but through steadfastness. And not in authority, but in honor. Several weeks after the tribute ceremony, when the excitement had begun to mellow into quieter reflections and permanent change, a curious thing happened in the Fairview High archives. In the small, rarely visited records room on the second floor, tucked between shelves of aging yearbooks and dusty administrative binders, a student intern named Joel Brennan stumbled upon a faded manila envelope. It was wedged between boxes labeled Custodia Work Orders 1999 to 2005 and District Budget Memos archived. Joel had only been there to retrieve old student council documents for a faculty advisor, but something about the envelope caught his eye. The handwriting on the front was neat, military-grade cursive with bold lettering that read, "To be opened only if Boyd leaves." Curiosity sparked. Joel brought it down to Principal Alvarez. Though she was still new in her role, taking over from Dr. Hartley, she had already developed a reputation for being open-minded and eager to learn from the school's complicated past. She sat at her desk, eyes narrowing at the envelope in her hands. Harland's name, the instructions, the strange condition attached to its opening. It didn't look official, not school-issued, but it also wasn't something to ignore. When she slit the seal open and unfolded the letter inside, her breath caught. It wasn't one letter. It was two. The first was clearly from Harland himself, dated over 10 years ago, written in pen on plain yellow legal paper with that same military sharpness in his script. It was a private memo addressed not to the administration, but to whoever takes my place. The message wasn't bitter or dramatic. Instead, it was filled with simple, practical instructions. It included notes on weak electrical outlets behind the gym stage, a recommendation to check the boiler pressure every other Wednesday rather than monthly due to a known quirk in the line, and a list of students over the years who had confided in him about home troubles, some now graduated, others likely still in school. The letter was a masterclass in quiet stewardship, the kind that no job description ever required, but that only someone with true investment in a place would bother to write. But the second letter was the one that stunned Principal Alvarez. It was written on Department of Defense letterhead. It bore a signature that matched General Marcus Torn's and date-stamped 12 years prior. It was a letter of recommendation for Harland Boyd,
addressed to the superintendent of the district. The general had written it the same year Harland had accepted his position at Fairview. In it, he had explained in no uncertain terms who Harland Boyd was, a decorated logistics specialist with multiple tours under his belt, a man whose understanding of systems, crisis management, and human behavior had saved lives time and time again. The general made it clear Harland Boyd wasn't looking for praise or promotions. He was seeking peace, but the letter urged the school to understand that in hiring him, they weren't merely getting a janitor, they were gaining a guardian, a quiet protector.
The letter had been filed away, ignored, forgotten. Whether through oversight or willful dismissal, no one at the time had followed up. It had sat in the archives unseen for over a decade, until now. Principal Alvarez sat back in her chair, heart pounding. It was one thing to know Harland's story through rumor, ceremony, or even his speech. It was another thing to see it in ink, predicted and proven long before the public revelation. This wasn't just a story of misjudgment. It was a case study in systemic blindness. The district had been given the truth on a silver platter and still failed to look. It was all there, buried just deep enough to escape notice, but close enough that the right pair of eyes could have seen it at any time. She called an emergency meeting with the board, not out of scandal or to assign blame, but to face what had been missed. When she placed the two letters on the center of the conference table, the reaction was muted. Not because it lacked impact, but because it added weight to something they were already reckoning with. Confirmation, validation, and shame. One board member, Mr. Kowalski, leaned forward and simply said, "We were given a treasure map and threw it in a drawer." No one corrected him. The story quickly became local news, not sensationalized, not exploited, but as a follow-up, an echo. New evidence emerges on Harland Boyd's hidden contributions. The media didn't run headlines meant to provoke. Instead, they framed it around the question everyone now seemed to be asking. How often do we ignore wisdom because it arrives without a title? Within the school itself, students took this new revelation to heart. One English teacher, Miss Redmond, had her junior class read both letters aloud in class, and then assigned a reflective essay titled, "The Unseen Leader." What followed was one of the most emotional collections of student writing she had received in years. Essays spoke of grandfathers who had worked as janitors, mothers who cleaned offices at night, and neighbors who volunteered in silence. Some students wrote about themselves, recognizing how they'd often dismissed people who didn't speak loud enough to demand attention. One essay simply ended with, "I want to be the kind of person who sees." Inspired by the discovery, the school's journalism club created a new project called Unsung Voices. Every month, they would feature a profile on someone in the community, not the usual leaders or performers, but the invisible backbone. The crossing guard, the cafeteria baker, the elderly woman who sewed costumes for school plays from home. It became a beloved tradition, and it all traced back to Harland. Even local colleges took notice. A scholarship fund was created in Harland Boyd's name, not for athletes or valedictorians, but for students pursuing vocational trades, community service, or maintenance careers. The motto of the scholarship read, "Honor through quiet excellence." Harland himself kept a respectful distance from the renewed spotlight. He continued his quiet retirement with his family, occasionally answering letters sent by students or faculty, always with humility, never with fanfare. He didn't return to campus, though invitations came often. He believed his time there was over, that his lesson had already been taught, but each response he wrote ended the same way. Be better stewards of the people you don't see. They are the keepers of everything that matters. And so the school, the town even, did just that.
They remembered. They looked deeper. And for the first time in a long time, they saw. By the time fall came around again, the rhythm of Fairview High had settled into something different than it had been before Harland Boyd's departure. Not faster or slower, just deeper. The halls were still crowded with chatter and textbooks and hurried feet between bells, but a subtle awareness lingered in the air, like a memory that hadn't yet faded. New teachers who didn't know Harland directly had already heard the stories, pieced together from bits of student essays, conversations with faculty, and the framed photograph now mounted in the east hallway under a plaque that read, "Service Beyond Sight." Some students passed it every day without pausing, but others stopped once in a while, looking up into the quiet eyes of the man who had once swept these same corridors in silence. Yet, even as the school changed, the district board, the ones responsible for his removal, remained in an awkward kind of limbo. No one had come out to apologize directly to Harland beyond the ceremony, and though the general's public appearance had forced many of them into a kind of self-reckoning, the underlying shame remained largely unspoken. Meetings became more rigid, protocol-heavy, each one tinged with the discomfort of people trying to prove they had moved on, without quite addressing what still hung in the air. They had fired a man for being too old, without ever learning who he truly was. And though they'd stood on stage while the general praised him, most had never uttered a word of personal accountability. One day, in early October, that changed. It began not with a speech or announcement, but with a gesture. During a scheduled facilities report, Mrs. Carol Denning, one of the more reserved board members, requested an item be added to the agenda. She asked to revisit the custodial department's staffing policy, specifically the age-related clauses that had quietly shaped hiring and firing practices over the past decade. Her voice was calm, but there was a steeliness to it that made the others look up from their papers. She recounted, without dramatics, how they had used policy as a shield, not to serve the school's needs, but to protect their assumptions. She spoke not about legal violations, but about moral failures,
About how, despite all they knew now, not a single one of them had sat down with Harland Boyd one-on-one and asked what he thought of it all. Silence filled the room. Even Superintendent Ellis, known for his fast responses and clean bureaucratic language, said nothing. What could he say? Everything Denning had voiced was true. In the weeks that followed, the board began reaching out, individually, quietly, without press releases or grandstanding. Mr. Kowalski was the first. He visited Harland's modest home unannounced, holding a box under one arm. It contained the nameplate from Harland's old custodial closet door, polished and mounted in a small wooden frame. Kowalski handed it over without ceremony, simply saying that it had belonged with Harland all along. He didn't offer a speech, he didn't beg forgiveness, but he said, plainly, that he had been wrong and that he should have seen what was in front of him a long time ago. Harland had accepted it with his usual grace, offering the man a cup of coffee and a seat on the porch. They sat for over an hour without raising their voices, two men who had once stood on opposite sides of an invisible wall, now simply talking. Others followed. Not all visits were the same. Some brought letters, some brought nothing but an honest face and a desire to look Harland in the eye and admit they had failed. Harland never turned them away. He didn't gloat, he didn't offer easy absolution either, but he listened, nodding occasionally, sometimes sharing a quiet story of a time when he too had misjudged someone in his youth. In those moments, it became clear that the lesson Harland had come to teach wasn't just about not judging. It was about restoration, about the dignity of seeing people try to make things right even when it came too late for a formal correction. At the school itself, the practical echoes of Harland's work kept unfolding. The student body petitioned to rename the annual Student Leadership Award after him. Not because he had led with titles or charisma,
but because he had demonstrated something far more enduring: stewardship without spotlight. The new custodian, Derek Lane, a younger man who had once served in the Navy himself, took it upon himself to maintain Harland's systems, not just the equipment, but the philosophy. He kept a hand-annotated binder of changes and repairs, just as Harland once had, and trained student aides in maintenance with the same care and patience. He never claimed to be Harland's replacement, only his student. Back in Harland's home, the walls remained simple. No military plaques, no newspaper clippings. The photograph from the tribute event had been placed on a shelf, next to a worn, leather-bound copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. But one new item stood out: a small framed card from a freshman named Caleb, who had once struggled with anxiety so badly that he avoided public speaking altogether. In it, he thanked Harland for finding his lost sketchbook and returning it with a note that simply read, "Your drawings say more than words ever could." That single act had led Caleb to join the art club and eventually win a regional scholarship. It was that kind of legacy Harland had left, not one of headlines, but of ripple effects. Quiet, persistent, and lasting. And while some in town still spoke about the general's dramatic arrival or the board's eventual backpedaling, others understood that the true story wasn't in the revelation, it was in the aftermath, in the slow, deliberate unraveling of prejudice, in the reshaping of a school's culture, in the kind of healing that can only happen when pride is set aside long enough to let truth in. Harland Boyd hadn't just changed a school. He had changed the way it saw. And now, as the fall leaves began to scatter across the old maintenance path behind the gym, students passing by no longer walked past that space without noticing it. Some picked up leaves. Some straightened fallen signs. One or two even lingered near the old boiler room door, the one that still bore the faint etching of Harland's initials in the frame's inner corner, unnoticed by most. But the ones who saw it, they smiled. Because now, they knew. Winter came early that year in Fairview, blanketing the school grounds with a soft hush that made everything seem more still, more reflective. Snow clung to the bare branches outside classroom windows, and the sidewalks, once echoing with the shuffle of hurried sneakers and half-laughed jokes, were now lined with slow, careful steps as students crunched their way to class. Inside the school, something more subtle had shifted, not just in policies or procedures, but in the hearts and attitudes of the people who moved through those familiar halls. The story of Harland Boyd had, by now, seeped into the collective consciousness of the school community like heat into old pipes, slow, steady, and unmistakable. It wasn't just the plaque or the new annual award in his name anymore. It was the way people had started looking at each other, or rather, seeing each other differently. The hall monitors, the cafeteria workers, the substitute teachers, all those roles that had once barely drawn a second glance now garnered acknowledgement, even conversation. There was a new understanding that value wasn't always wrapped in authority or loudness. Sometimes it moved through the school quietly with a mop in hand, or with a clipboard filled with notes on emergency exit repairs.
Students, too, began to mirror the change. Mrs. Edelstein's 11th grade English class had an assignment titled The Unsung Hero, and over half the essays submitted focused not on celebrities or athletes, but on people within the school, including Derek Lane, the new custodian, and Miss Talia, the night security guard, who always kept snacks in her drawer for kids who missed dinner. In one poignant essay, a junior wrote about how he used to make fun of Harland Boyd behind his back, calling him the ghost of the hallway for the way he would appear and disappear silently during after-school events. But now, knowing who he was and what he'd done, the student couldn't walk past the East Wing without feeling a pang of guilt and respect. Even the teaching staff, always pressed for time and energy, had begun to take smaller steps toward that deeper awareness.
Mr. Connors, the world history teacher, started every Monday with a brief Hidden Hero segment, asking students to name someone they'd seen doing something helpful without recognition. At first, the names came slowly, hesitantly, but by December, the list grew each week, covering a board with small moments, a junior helping clean up after a science lab spill that wasn't hers, a teacher assistant staying late to reorganize the art room, a lunch staff member helping a kid zip up his coat on a freezing afternoon. Outside the school walls, the local community was catching on too. The town newspaper, once dismissive in its coverage of internal school matters, ran a Sunday editorial titled "The Measure of a Man," reflecting on the way Harland's story had reshaped public conversations about aging, respect, and invisible labor. Letters to the editor followed, many from former students who recalled how Harland had impacted them in ways they hadn't recognized until now: the fixed locker, the found phone, the gently closed door after they'd cried in the stairwell. His name became something more than just the label of a man. It became shorthand for integrity, service, and quiet strength. At the board level, Carol Denning's quiet push for reform had started gaining momentum. Other districts had taken notice. A delegation from a nearby county even reached out for guidance, curious about how Fairview was handling custodial and support staff with new dignity-based policies. What had started as an awkward reckoning was becoming a model for others. It wasn't that the school was now perfect, far from it. Mistakes were still made. People were still people. But the culture had cracked open in a way that allowed for something real to grow, something rooted not in image or status, but in the truth of lived experience. As for Harland Boyd, he had never sought any of this. In fact, he rarely ventured back into the school itself. He said he didn't want to be a symbol, just a man who had done his job. But that didn't stop him from accepting invitations now and then, especially the quiet ones, the ones that came without headlines or microphones. Like the day he was asked to visit the vocational tech class, where a group of students had been struggling with wiring diagrams. Their instructor had remembered hearing that Harland used to handle the building's most complex circuit repairs without ever referencing a manual. When Harland walked in, slow, steady, same work boots as always, the room fell silent, not out of awe, but respect. He didn't lecture. He just watched, then asked a few simple questions. Before long, the students were nodding, tools in hand, confidence rising with each answer he coaxed out of them. Later that afternoon, he left behind a diagram he'd drawn on the back of a scrap cardboard sheet, a simplified layout of how to manage three-way switches without overloading the circuit. One of the students framed it. Another memorized it. It was just a diagram, but they treated it like gospel. In the staff room, there was a coffee mug with Boyd's rules printed on the side. It was a joke at first, made by one of the younger teachers, but over time, they began to quote it seriously. Rule number 1, do what needs to be done, not what gets you noticed. Rule number 2, fix it before someone complains. Rule number 3, if you see someone struggling, don't ask if they need help. Just help. The rules were never written by Harland, but everyone knew they were his in spirit. By the end of the semester, it was clear that the school wasn't just honoring Harland because of his past. They were evolving because of what he had modeled in the present, and not by shouting or demanding change, by simply being who he was, a man who lived his values even when no one was looking. The true revelation wasn't in the general speech or the shocked boardroom silence that had followed. It was in these ripples, small, consistent waves of respect and awareness that continued long after Harland had walked out those doors. And the best part? The next generation was paying attention. There was something different about Fairview High School now, though it couldn't be pointed to in the blueprints or captured on a budget spreadsheet. It was a shift in tone, a new frequency just beneath the noise of morning announcements, locker slams, and bell chimes. It hummed beneath conversations in the teacher's lounge and in the subtle nods exchanged between staff who had for the first time in years begun to speak to one another with sincere regard. Even the students, particularly the seniors who had witnessed the drama of Harland Boyd's departure and reemergence, carried themselves with a slightly different awareness, a quiet reverence for the idea that not all power wears a title. Harland had refused every offer to return to full-time work.
Not out of resentment, and not even out of principle. He simply said he was doing other things now, helping his neighbor retrofit her home for wheelchair access, tutoring local vets on how to use their new phones, volunteering with a nonprofit that repaired homes for elderly widows. He stayed busy the way old warriors often did, never idle, never loud, just moving from one useful act to the next. But he never stopped teaching. It began informally, a call from the school's new head custodian, Derek Lane, asking if he could shadow Harland on a few particularly tricky boiler resets. Then it was a second-year math teacher wanting to know if Harland could help with rewiring a broken smartboard projector before the district scheduled a contractor. Eventually, students were involved. Harland began holding once-a-month Saturday workshops, unofficial, unpaid, unadvertised, where he taught practical skills, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to use a multimeter, how to patch drywall, and even how to run a basic first aid response drill. No certificates, no press, just knowledge passed on the way it used to be, from calloused hands to eager ones. The workshops grew not because they were promoted, but because they worked. Word spread, and soon there was a waiting list. Students began bringing their siblings. Parents showed up and stayed to watch. Even some of the school board members, the same who once dismissed Harland as a relic of a bygone era, quietly attended one Saturday, sitting in the back as he explained the function of a ground felt interrupter and its role in home safety. No one took photos. That was part of the deal. Harland didn't want attention. He wanted understanding. One Saturday afternoon, a senior named Raymond asked Harland why he was doing all this when he didn't have to. Harland paused, then leaned on the workbench and answered simply, "Because someone once taught me, and they never asked for anything either." He told a story then, one he had never shared before, about a man named Master Sergeant Ellis, his first CO in Afghanistan, a grizzled, uncompromising veteran who taught Harland everything, from reading terrain under moonlight to keeping his team calm when chaos erupted. Ellis never raised his voice, never lectured. He just showed up, day after day, quietly doing what others couldn't or wouldn't, teaching by doing, leading by listening. When Ellis was killed during a nighttime extraction op, Harland had carried that man's silence with him ever since. He said it was a debt he could never repay except by passing it forward. That story stuck with Raymond, and with every student within earshot. Suddenly, Harland Boyd wasn't just the hero who had once been a janitor, he was the steward of something sacred, something old and nearly forgotten, the dignity of competence, the strength of humility, the sacredness of teaching without an agenda. By January, the district had reached out to Harland with a new offer, this time not as a custodian or even a consultant, but as an honorary mentor in their vocational pathway program. He could design his own schedule, dictate his own terms, work when and how he pleased. The offer came with funding and recognition, but Harland turned it down, kindly. He said he didn't need a title to teach. He didn't need a program to share what he knew. Everything he had to offer fit into a toolbox, a notebook, and a little time. And so he kept doing it his way, from the shadows. Still, his influence grew. The vocational program began incorporating elements from his workshops. Teachers started requesting his input when designing practical assessments. The maintenance staff began referring to his system logs like sacred texts. And when emergencies arose, a sudden power outage in the science wing, or a stuck elevator with 2 students trapped inside, it was Harland they called first. Not because they had to, because they knew he'd know what to do, and he'd do it without panic or pride. The most surprising change came from Principal Ortega, the same man who had once championed the board's decision to let Harland go. Ortega had undergone a quiet transformation. He started attending every Saturday session, never front and center, but always present. He took notes. He asked questions.
He even began holding monthly roundtables with support staff to better understand their challenges. One day, he told Harlan something few expected, that he had been wrong. Not just about firing him, but about how leadership works. He admitted that he had thought order came from structure and protocol. Now he understood that true leadership came from service. Harlan didn't gloat. He never even spoke of the firing again. When asked by a local paper for a quote about how he felt being let go and then quietly re-elevated by the very system that had discarded him, Harlan gave them just one sentence. "I was never doing it for them in the first place." In a way, that line became legendary. It echoed through the halls, quoted in graduation speeches, posted above whiteboards and staff room bulletin boards. Because in a world obsessed with recognition, Harland Boyd had reminded everyone of a deeper truth, that character is what you build when no one is clapping, that legacy is not etched in trophies, but in trust, that teaching isn't always about classrooms or curriculums. Sometimes it's just about showing up, rolling up your sleeves, and leaving something better than you found it. And while Harland may have stayed in the shadows, the light he left behind was unmistakable. A glow of competence, of quiet mastery, and of the kind of honor that doesn't need applause to matter.
The students didn't know what the assembly was for. The flyers said it was to honor a member of the community, but no one could remember the last time the school held an assembly that wasn't about standardized testing or motivational speakers warning them about social media. Still, the gym filled quickly on that rainy Friday morning in March. Seniors filed in first, their movements slower, more knowing, as though they already suspected what this was really about. Juniors followed, whispering guesses and rumors. The freshmen and sophomores came last, some reluctantly, some bored, but all of them curious the moment they saw the stage setup. A simple lectern, a draped banner that read, "Legacy in Action," and 3 rows of chairs behind it, mostly empty. The air inside the gym was different. Not quite electric, but tense in the way things get just before something important happens. Teachers lined the back wall, whispering among themselves. Principal Ortega stood off to the side near the bleachers, not at the center like he usually was. Superintendent McAllister was there too, in a navy suit he only wore when cameras were expected. A few school board members sat in folding chairs, silent, and looking distinctly less self-assured than usual. But it wasn't the officials people noticed. It was the presence of General Marcus Thorne again, the man whose surprise entrance months ago had changed everything. He wasn't in uniform this time, but his posture and presence carried the same weight. He stood near the stage, hands folded behind his back, his eyes scanning the crowd not with scrutiny, but with reverence. And then Harland Boyd entered. No fanfare, no announcement. He simply walked in from the side door near the equipment cage, wearing his usual work boots, khaki trousers, and a flannel shirt that had clearly seen years of use. He wasn't dressed for a ceremony. He wasn't here for recognition. But when the students saw him, they stood. 1 row at a time, slowly at first, then all at once, the gym rising to its feet as if guided by instinct. There was no cheer, no chant, just the sound of hundreds of students clapping. Not because they were told to, not because it was scheduled, but because something inside them knew they should. Harlan paused, briefly taken aback, then gave a small nod. He didn't smile widely. He didn't raise a hand. He simply made his way to the side of the gym and leaned against the wall, like he always did, the watcher, not the center. Principal Ortega took the stage, looking out over the gym with a visible mixture of humility and pride. He cleared his throat once, then began. He spoke not like a leader addressing subordinates, but like a man correcting a mistake. He told the story, not the sanitized version, but the real one. How the school had let Harlan go, how they had failed to see the worth of a man who had been building more than just the physical structure of the school, how it took a moment of confrontation, of clarity, to reveal what should have always been obvious. He admitted fault, not just his own, but the institution's, and then he did something that had never happened at Fairview High in recent memory. He stepped aside and invited someone else to speak. General Thorne took the stage, but he didn't give a speech. He told a story.
Not about medals or battles, not about Harlan's past in the military, though he hinted at it with lines like the kind of man you want beside you in chaos and a leader disguised as a janitor, but about what real service looks like. He spoke of duty that doesn't come with praise, of leadership that whispers instead of shouting. He talked about the importance of watching how a man behaves when no one is watching. And he ended with this: in a world full of titles and noise, Harland Boyd reminds us that your worth is measured not by what's on your name badge, but by the lives you quietly hold together. He motioned toward Harland, who still hadn't moved, and the applause returned, louder this time, longer. Students began clapping overhead on bleachers, stomping their feet. It wasn't loud like a concert. It was reverent, a living ovation. Ortega returned to the lectern, and after the noise calmed, he reached for a small box and opened it. Inside was a plaque, simple and understated. It read, "Harland Boyd, in grateful recognition of a legacy built not with words, but with work." He invited Harlan up, and for a brief moment, the old man looked like he might decline, but he stepped forward, took the plaque, nodded, and said nothing. Instead of speaking from the lectern, he looked at the students directly, and then, in his usual quiet voice, he said just one thing. "I didn't stay here all those years because I had to. I stayed because I believed in what this place could be. I still do." That was all. But that sentence, that simple, unpolished sentence, did something no speech could. It grounded the whole experience. It brought the past and present together. It reminded every person in that gym that institutions are made of people, and people are shaped by the ones willing to do the quiet work, the hard work, with no promise of reward. After the assembly, no one rushed out. Students lingered. Teachers gathered in small groups. Even the board members didn't bolt for the parking lot. Harlan stood near the exit, shaking hands with some, hugging others, speaking quietly with students who lined up just to say thank you. Some brought handwritten notes. One student handed him a wrench wrapped in ribbon. Another gave him a photo of the two of them fixing a locker from years ago. He didn't say much, but his presence said everything.
And as the gym emptied, as the last echoes of applause faded, the school was different. Not just because they had honored a forgotten man, but because they had learned to see, to look beyond titles, to recognize wisdom, to honor service in its truest form. And most of all, they had learned never to underestimate a man with a mop and a past. In the weeks following the assembly, something strange began to happen at Fairview High. It wasn't dramatic or noisy, and it didn't make the local news. It didn't involve new technology grants or viral social media campaigns, but it changed the tone of the hallways, the shape of conversations, and the subtle rhythm of everyday life. It was the kind of change that began in how people looked at each other. Not just the way students looked at Harland Boyd, but the way they looked at the others they had never really seen before. The cafeteria worker who always offered extra portions to quiet kids. The school secretary who remembered every student's name and birthday. The groundskeeper with the limp who could identify every tree on campus. These were the people who had existed in the background, blending into the institutional noise. But now, people started to notice them. And more importantly, they started to ask questions about who they really were. For years, the staff room had been divided. Teachers ate at one table, admin at another, and custodial or kitchen staff rarely entered at all. But not anymore. One Thursday afternoon, Mr. Patel, the AP physics teacher, invited Harland to join him for coffee during lunch. By the following week, Harland was there every day, sitting beside teachers, joking with the guidance counselor, discussing local history with the art teacher. No one told him to come. No one formally welcomed him. But a chair was always left open at the end of the table, and it was quietly understood that it belonged to him.
Students began approaching him in the halls, not just to say thank you, but to ask for advice, to show him their shop class projects, to ask if he knew how to fix something. And he always did. A broken guitar string, a rusted bike chain, a jammed vending machine. The answers flowed from his hands like second nature. But now, they were met not with surprise, but with respect. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer background. But what truly marked the shift was what happened in the classroom. Inspired by the assembly, Mr. Rivera, in the history department, created a new unit called Local Legends. Students were assigned to interview someone from the community whose story had never been told. Veterans, retired nurses, factory workers, caretakers, small business owners, people who didn't have Wikipedia pages or plaques on walls. One group of juniors interviewed Harland. He agreed, reluctantly, on the condition that they not focus on that military stuff. But they did their research anyway. They found references to old missions, scanned records from military operations decades old, and pieced together a timeline that read like something out of a Tom Clancy novel. But what impressed them most wasn't what he had done during the war. It was how he had come home and chosen a life of quiet service, trading medals for mops and command centers for creaky school hallways. Their final project included not just a report, but a short video presentation. It showed Harland unlocking the doors before dawn, repairing a leaky pipe, pausing to hand a tissue to a crying student in the hallway. Then it cut to a photo of him in uniform, standing beside General Thorne in a grainy old black and white frame. The video ended with a quote. Quote, "Real heroes don't retire. They just keep showing up." That video circulated beyond the school. Parents saw it. Local veterans organizations saw it. Even the mayor's office requested a copy. A few weeks later, Harland was invited to speak, reluctantly again, at the town's Memorial Day ceremony. He declined the podium, but agreed to attend. When they asked him to stand for recognition, he shook his head. But when the crowd rose in applause, he stood anyway with his hat in hand and nodded once. And it wasn't just about him. His story opened something wider in the town. The school board, perhaps nudged by shame or clarity or both, launched a new recognition program for classified staff. Not just teachers of the month, but maintenance workers, food servers, bus drivers, aides. People whose names had never made it into newsletters now found themselves receiving thank you notes, gift cards, handmade posters from students. The culture of the school shifted from one of hierarchy to one of mutual regard. Not perfect, not overnight, but real. General Thorne, for his part, faded back into the shadows. He had done what he came to do. His brief appearance had been like a lightning strike, shocking, illuminating, and then gone. But he left behind a letter addressed to the school community. It was printed and posted in the front office window. In it, he wrote, "You never truly know the battles someone has fought or the peace they've chosen to keep. Some people serve quietly because they understand that the deepest forms of leadership don't seek applause, they seek purpose. Mr. Boyd's presence at your school has been one of silent excellence. I hope you will always recognize those among you who lead not with volume, but with virtue." Harland himself never changed much. He didn't start wearing his old medals. He didn't grow louder or more boastful. He still walked with a slight limp, still carried the same ring of keys, still repaired things no one else noticed.
But his face softened more often. He smiled a little more, and when people passed him in the hallway now, they didn't look past him. They looked to him. Some nodded, some said hello. Others just smiled, the way you do when you're in the presence of someone who matters. There was one more change, subtle but powerful.
Every spring, the senior class would vote on someone to give the honorary graduation address. Usually it was a teacher or counselor. That year, the vote was unanimous. And, though Harlan protested, though he said he wasn't speech material, he showed up anyway. On that warm June afternoon, under a cloudless sky, he stood on the small makeshift stage, looked out over the rows of caps and gowns, and said, "I've seen a lot of things in my time. Built things, broken things. Watched people change, and sometimes not change at all. But the most important thing I ever learned is that what you do when no one's looking is who you really are. And from what I've seen, I think you all have a pretty good shot at becoming people worth remembering." That was it. No elaborate speech, no long stories. Just Harland Boyd, the janitor they had once let go, standing before a sea of students who would never forget him. And somewhere, sitting quietly in the back row in civilian clothes, General Marcus Thorne nodded once and disappeared into the crowd. Summer slipped into Fairview with a golden kind of silence. The hallways of the school, once filled with the hum of student voices and the rhythm of lockers slamming shut, now echoed with a deeper stillness. Most of the students had gone off to vacation, jobs, or the nervous anticipation of college. But Harland Boyd remained. He always did. In the mornings, he arrived before the sun, his footsteps steady and familiar across the linoleum floors. He checked the boilers, mended broken fixtures, and tightened whatever had loosened over the course of the year. His movements were slow but deliberate, his presence a quiet reassurance that no matter what else changed, the foundation remained strong. But that summer felt different, and everyone knew it, though no one said it out loud. The rumor, of course, had started even before the last bell rang in June. Harland might finally retire. It wasn't confirmed, and he himself never spoke of it, but something about the way he lingered in certain places, as if saying silent goodbyes, made people wonder. His office, a cluttered space near the boiler room, had started to look more organized, less lived in. Old tools were being donated to the shop class. A few worn books on field repairs and engineering had quietly appeared in the library's staff picks shelf with a small handwritten card that read, "Still works if you're willing to learn." The principal, Mr. Kinsey, stopped by one afternoon with a half-formed question on his lips. He found Harlan oiling the hinges of a back door that no one else ever used. Mr. Kinsey started to speak, then hesitated, then just stood there. Harlan didn't look up right away. When he did, it was with a tired but knowing smile. Nothing needed to be said. The nod between them was enough. Over the summer, something remarkable began to take shape. A group of seniors, now officially graduates, spearheaded a campaign. It started small. A few emails, a flyer in the town square, a GoFundMe page with modest expectations, but within a week, it had caught fire. Alumni shared it, parents donated, teachers spread the word, local businesses chipped in, and before long, the campaign surpassed its goal threefold. What had begun as a modest idea, a bench dedicated in Harlan's name, evolved into something much more ambitious. By late July, construction had begun on the far corner of the school's courtyard in the quietest spot under the oldest oak tree. Brick by brick, volunteers from the community, many of them former students, laid the foundation for what would become the Harland Boyd Learning Pavilion. It wasn't grand, not in the way that city monuments are, but it was real and lasting. A covered structure with seating, electrical outlets, and even a small library annex built into the side. It was a place to study, to think, to gather. A space that would remind every student who passed through Fairview High School that wisdom could come from anywhere, and that some of the most important lessons were never written on a whiteboard. The dedication ceremony took place in early August. It wasn't on any official calendar, and there was no media coverage, but the turnout was staggering. Students from 20 years back returned, many bringing their own children. Teachers old and new stood shoulder to shoulder.
Veterans from nearby towns arrived in pressed uniforms, some saluting as they approached the small podium. And near the front, on a simple folding chair, sat Harland, freshly shaven, in a clean button-down shirt, his hands folded over his lap. There were no long speeches, just a few words from Mr. Kinsey, a heartfelt story from a former student who had once nearly dropped out before Harland found him crying behind the gym and quietly walked him back to class. And finally, a reading of the dedication plaque. It read, "To Harland Boyd, who taught us that service needs no spotlight, that dignity wears work boots, and that quiet strength changes everything." When they unveiled the plaque, Harland didn't stand. He simply bowed his head, overcome, and remained silent for a long time. Then slowly he rose to his feet, approached the microphone, and said just one thing. "All I ever wanted was to leave something better than I found it. You all just made that true." Applause rose and fell like waves. No ovation could match the weight of what he meant to those people, but they gave it anyway.
The following Monday, Harland submitted his retirement letter. It was typed, not handwritten, and just one paragraph long. He didn't mention medals or missions, didn't reference the assembly or the general or the whirlwind of attention that had followed. He simply wrote that it had been an honor to serve, that he believed the school was in good hands, and that he would be around if anyone ever needed a stubborn lock opened or a story shared over black coffee. He left on a Friday morning. No one saw him go. That was his way. But when teachers returned the next week, they found something waiting in the staff room, a hand-carved wooden box, polished to a warm shine, with a note tucked beneath it. The note said, "Tools still work. Just don't forget to look for what needs fixing." Inside the box were his most used tools. Not new ones, but the same ones he'd carried for years. A screwdriver worn smooth at the grip, a small flashlight with paint marks from a dozen classrooms, a pocket knife engraved with the initials MT, a silent gift, it seemed, from General Thorne. They weren't there to gather dust. They were there to be used, passed down, shared. A legacy not of glory, but of care. Years later, when students strolled through the courtyard and passed beneath the oak tree, they would sit at the Boyd Pavilion and feel a calmness they couldn't quite name. Teachers would point to the plaque and tell new hires, "You missed knowing him, but trust me, he's why this place feels the way it does." And sometimes, just sometimes, an old man in a worn cap would appear in the back of the crowd at graduation or a school fair, standing alone with a familiar posture, hands clasped behind his back, eyes taking it all in. He never needed a statue. He never wanted one. He had something better. A story carried in the hearts of those who finally learned to see him.